It began in the ruins of a war that refused to die. By the spring of 1945, Germany was a nation of ghosts. Cities once alive with marching boots and speeches were now silent, their streets reduced to ash and echo. The Reich had collapsed from within, its armies scattered, its leaders dead or in hiding. But something darker still lingered beneath the rubble, a kind of intelligence, a knowledge that could not be bombed out of existence. In laboratories buried deep under mountains, inside factories camouflaged by forests, men in white coats had been working in secret while the rest of the world burned. They weren't soldiers. They didn't fight with guns or tanks. Their weapons were equations, engines, and blueprints, technologies years ahead of anything the Allies had. Rocket propulsion, jet aircraft, chemical warfare, even early concepts of space travel. And as Berlin fell, every major power realized the same terrifying truth. Germany might have lost the war, but its science could still win the next one. In the chaos that followed Hitler's suicide, thousands of scientists vanished. Some fled west toward the American lines, others east toward the Soviets, each carrying whatever secrets they could salvage. Blueprints, prototypes, even entire research teams. The roads were filled with them. Convoys of trucks packed with papers and instruments, men burning documents one moment and negotiating their surrender the next. No one knew who would find them first. The Americans called it exploitation. The Soviets called it reparations. But beneath the official words was something far simpler, a race. A silent, desperate competition, not for land or ideology, but for intellect. Whoever captured the minds of Nazi science would hold the key to the future. In the weeks after Germany's surrender, Allied intelligence units moved like shadows across the country. They weren't hunting generals or SS officers. They were looking for mathematicians, chemists, engineers, men whose crimes were not on battlefields, but on drawing boards. Men like Werner von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, the weapon that had fallen from the sky without warning, killing thousands in London and Antwerp. Von Braun and his team had already begun to see which way the wind was blowing. As Soviet troops advanced toward their testing facility at Peenemünde, they destroyed what they could and gathered what they couldn't carry. When the Americans arrived days later, they found a trail of wreckage and a group of exhausted scientists waving white flags. To the soldiers who captured them, they were just another cluster of German prisoners. But to the men in Washington, they were something else entirely. A miracle, a prize beyond calculation. That summer, an order circulated quietly through the U.S. military. It bore a simple name, Operation Paperclip. The title came from the paperclips fastened to the files of select German scientists whose records would be cleaned for entry into the United States. Their Nazi affiliations, party membership, SS rank, forced labor connections, would be quietly removed or rewritten. The objective was clear: bring them to America, protect them from prosecution, and put their knowledge to work before the Soviets could do the same. It was an operation born not of morality, but of necessity. The Cold War was already taking shape, even before the last war had finished. And in that new world, there was no time for ethics, only advantage. At first, it was small. A few dozen scientists flown to Texas and New Mexico under false identities. But as the scope of their knowledge became clear, the project expanded. Soon there were hundreds, then over 1,000. They were settled in military bases, given new homes, new names, and in some cases, new pasts. In White Sands, New Mexico, the desert echoed with the sound of rockets built from parts scavenged from German warehouses. The same designs that had terrorized Europe now soared harmlessly into the sky under the American flag. Engineers watched in awe as the V-2s screamed upward, breaking records once thought impossible. The future of spaceflight had been born from the wreckage of the Reich. But not everyone was impressed. In Washington, quiet arguments erupted behind closed doors. Some officers were uneasy, not just about what these men had done, but who they had been. Many of the scientists had worked directly with the Nazi regime, had overseen slave labor in underground factories where thousands died building their machines. Some were rumored to have experimented on prisoners in camps, yet every time the question was raised, every time someone asked whether it was right to protect such men, the answer came back the same. If we don't, the Soviets will. So the paperwork continued, and the clips kept fastening. In Huntsville, Alabama, Werner von Braun and his rocket team were given a new laboratory and a new mission: to develop missiles for the U.S. Army. They called them research vehicles, though everyone knew what they really were: the first steps toward an intercontinental delivery system capable of carrying atomic warheads across the globe. Von Braun smiled for photographs, shaking hands with generals, his past fading quietly into classified files. To the public, he was a visionary engineer. To the military, he was a strategic asset. To the few who remembered Peenemünde and the Vi-2 factories, he was something far more complicated. By 1947, the Soviet Union had launched its own version of Paperclip, abducting thousands of German scientists from the occupied zone. They were shipped east, forced to work in secret institutes outside Moscow. For years, both nations studied the same designs, the same equations, each trying to outpace the other. The Cold War's first battlefield wasn't fought with tanks or troops. It was fought with minds. And in the middle of that silent conflict, the ghosts of the past refused to fade. Some of the scientists kept to themselves, working quietly, grateful to have survived. Others spoke of destiny, of using their knowledge for peace, for progress. But in the corridors of the Pentagon, there was always an unease, a sense that something unnatural had been smuggled into the American conscience. It wasn't just technology that had crossed the ocean. It was ideology, ambition, and a certain belief that ends could justify means, that morality could be bent, if only far enough to reach the stars. And in time, that belief would define an entire era. Because in the name of security, America had invited the devil to dinner, and convinced itself that it could keep him on a leash. They arrived as ghosts, and then learned how to live like neighbors. At first, they spoke softly, German vowels tucked behind careful smiles, their suitcases filled with slide rules and photographs of laboratories that no longer existed. They signed their new names on base ledgers and were issued badges and ration books, escorted past fences topped with barbed wire into barracks that smelled of solvent and desert dust. The army called the place Fort Bliss. Beyond it lay white sands, a miles-wide emptiness where the wind erased footprints before anyone could follow them. Out there, the rockets were lifted onto launch stands that looked like gallows and pointed toward a sky that belonged to no one. They were told what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. A Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency officer would explain the rules with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. You are here as technical specialists. Your backgrounds are irrelevant to your present usefulness. Your correspondence is monitored for your safety and ours. Someone would place a manila folder on the table, a paperclip gleaming along the edge, and the past would slide quietly out of view. In the mornings, buses carried the team to the desert, where V-2 sections were bolted together from crates, marked in a language the guards pretended not to read. The rocket engines coughed awake, and for a few seconds the horizon bent as though the earth itself were listening. Americans who had learned their trade repairing farm machinery now worked beside men who had designed vehicles that fell on London without warning. Between them passed wrenches, calculations, and silence. When the launches succeeded, the ground shook, and the technicians cheered as if they had watched a thunderstorm, choosing to go elsewhere. When a guidance unit stuttered and a vehicle corkscrewed into the basin, the mood on the range turned solemn, not because of the loss of equipment, but because failure invited questions, and questions led back to places no one wanted to describe. In the evenings, over weak coffee in cinderblock rooms, the engineers traced trajectories in the air with their fingers and spoke softly of improvements: gimbaled nozzles, better propellant pumps, cleaner separation. People who had never met on a battlefield were learning to complete each other's sentences. The country around them tried to pretend this was normal. In El Paso, the grocery clerks smiled at the men with unfamiliar accents, who paid in cash and always had exact change. A few miles from the base, a new housing development rose overnight. Low roofs, neat hedges, a school within walking distance. Wives whose husbands had crossed the ocean under army escort learned how to host barbecues and say, "Have a nice day," with a practiced ease. The children were the quickest to adapt. They learned the Pledge of Allegiance and baseball rules in the same week, switching languages without noticing when they moved from playground to kitchen table. On paper, it looked like redemption. In reality, it was more like an eclipse, light passing through a darkness so complete that people convinced themselves the shadow was a form of safety. Even as the scientists posed for press photos beside captured rockets, the paperwork in the back rooms grew denser. Background checks moved like slow currents through the Pentagon. State Department memos objected, noting affiliations that couldn't be ignored. The replies were always measured, almost gentle. Security considerations outweigh other concerns. Denazification waivers have been issued. Delay risks Soviet acquisition. The Soviets, for their part, didn't waste time. Trains left Germany at night, windows blacked out, carrying engineers eastward into a geography of secrecy. There, in facilities where snow piled against fences and loudspeakers played music at dawn to wake the guards, a parallel future was being assembled. Two empires, each convinced the other was the animal in the dark, fed on the same scattered bones of German research. The center of gravity in America shifted south. Redstone Arsenal in Huntsville became a kind of waking dream, a place where past and future walked side by side and pretended not to notice each other. Military police patrolled the gates. Inside, a new language of acronyms replaced older, forbidden words. Redstone, Jupiter, Pershing. Names that sounded almost pastoral until you remembered what they would carry. The men who had once supervised underground factories now assembled teams, wrote procurement lists, worried about thrust-to-weight ratios, and proposed static fire tests, as if suggesting a Sunday picnic. On Sundays they went to church. That detail mattered to the locals. A man in a gray suit and courteous voice could be anything. A man who sang hymns with his children in the third pew was someone people were ready to forgive. Huntsville grew around them like a nervous promise. New schools, a parkway, a museum that would one day lift a rocket upright like a monument. The town learned to say space capital before it learned what that would cost. Not all of the newcomers were rocket men. Some wore the white coats of physicians, their specialties hovering around words that made ordinary people uneasy. Altitude physiology, hypoxia, decompression, the body under stress. They consulted on test chambers where volunteers breathed thin air and watched their vision turn to snow. They lectured at flight medicine conferences, publishing papers that spoke of the human body as an instrument to be tuned for the edge of the atmosphere. Their reputations rose quickly and then, in certain corners, began to flicker. Old accusations smoldered at the margins: camps, experiments, prisoners. Supporters insisted the charges were confused or Soviet propaganda. Detractors brought photographs and survivor testimonies that refused to be filed away. The country, which had learned during the war to live with contradiction, did what it always did. It looked forward very hard. Looking forward had its rewards. In the mid-1950s, test stands trembled as new engines roared to life. The first ballistic missiles lifted cleanly from southern soil, and the notion of distance changed overnight. A desert experiment hardened into a doctrine. Satellites were discussed in sentences that began with if and ended with when. The men from Germany, middle-aged now, carried clipboards past soldiers barely old enough to shave, and offered calm advice about staging and structural loads, the way farmers talk about the weather, respectful of its power, but unafraid to read its signs. In Washington, the debate never actually stopped. It simply grew quieter and moved down the hall. The FBI kept files that thickened like tree rings. Congressional staffers drafted questions that senior members chose not to ask. An ethics officer in a suit nobody noticed wrote memoranda, whose paragraphs closed on themselves like traps, and then filed them in cabinets that never saw daylight. "We are not endorsing the past," one line read. "We are preventing the future from being decided by others." Another memo trimmed the argument to a sentence sharp enough to cut. "Capability is itself a form of morality in a world where survival depends on it." Then, one autumn evening, the sky itself joined the conversation. A small sphere carrying a radio crossed above North America and said hello every 96 minutes in a voice even backyard enthusiasts could hear. People stepped outside in their slippers and stared upward, listening to a sound that was almost cheerful and felt like a threat. Teachers chalked orbital diagrams onto blackboards in towns where the loudest argument the day before had been about high school football. The future had arrived with a simple beep, and it was speaking Russian. What followed had the velocity of panic and the discipline of prayer. Money found its mark. Laboratories filled, graduate programs overflowed. A new agency with a clean name was created to catch up, and then to lead. The men in Huntsville were handed a mandate that sounded like absolution. Build something that can reach beyond the beeping, beyond the sky itself. The first American satellite went up on a pillar of heat, drawn by hands that knew too well what heat could do. On television, a soft-spoken engineer with a German accent pointed at a model of a launch vehicle and smiled with the easy confidence of someone who had finally found a stage large enough to eclipse his own history. But even as the nation exhaled, the quiet questions returned, not as accusations now, but as a kind of undertone. In a museum that displayed the future as a cheerful timeline, a war widow from London paused too long in front of the V2 exhibit. In a windowless room at the Justice Department, a new investigator reopened a folder and found that someone, years earlier, had carefully tucked one sheet of paper behind another. In a neighborhood where magnolia trees shaded neat lawns, a child doing homework asked a father what he had done before America, and watched the man's eyes drift to a corner of the room, as if there were something written there only he could read. The program expanded anyway, because that is what programs do when they are fed and praised. Facilities rose from swamp and scrub. The word astronaut entered the language and refused to leave. Flight surgeons perfected checklists for risks that normal medicine had never been asked to consider. Engineers solved problems no one had named 20 years before. A heat shield was designed that could survive a world's anger. A guidance computer learned to say yes or no in the silence of space. A command module's couch felt for a moment like the safest chair anyone had ever built. At night, in offices that smelled of hot plastic and coffee, a few of the old men worked later than they had to. They stood at the window and looked out over parking lots, where cars waited like patient animals. They would say to no one in particular that propulsion is a trade like any other, and that the universe doesn't ask for a resume. Then they would sit back down and edit a test plan, whose margins bore the faint imprint of a life that had been copied once too often. Outside those rooms, the country talked itself into a legend that America had taken the worst knowledge in the world and taught it to behave. It made for a beautiful story. It made people feel light as they watched a rocket rise, the flame so bright it briefly turned midnight into afternoon. For a few minutes, the sky carried all the weight, and the questions stayed on the ground. But weight returns, and questions learn how to climb. Reporters in the early 1960s, greedy for anything that could turn science into human drama, began tugging at threads. A byline mentioned a name that a survivor recognized. Letters followed. The past, patient and methodical, had been keeping pace all along. When the accusations surfaced, they arrived in careful paragraphs and footnotes rather than shouts. A laboratory resume placed beside a camp roster. A patent application dated a month after a set of deaths. A photograph where a face you wanted to admire stood 2 seats away from a uniform you couldn't ignore. The responses were what the responses had to be. Not the same man anymore. Different world now. Look at what we are building. And also, always, if not us, then them. In a sense, the rockets themselves answered. They rose, and the country rose with them because ascent is persuasive. But even as the altitude increased, the shadow of the launch pad stayed the same size on the ground. People learned to love 2 truths at once: that the path to the stars was being paved, and that some of the stones had been taken from a quarry no one wanted to visit again. By the time the decade turned, ambition had found its shape. The new machines had names that sounded like oaths. A schedule was drawn that would carry men farther than air had any right to allow. The teams fused into a single body, moving in one direction. A creature of deadlines and checklists, whose heartbeat was the countdown. And inside that rhythm, the bargain America had made began to glow with the strange light of inevitability. We will go where no one has gone because we must. We will use what we have because it is what the future demands. We will remember later. Later has a way of arriving exactly on time. It began, as most triumphs do, with a promise so vast that no one stopped to ask what it might cost. By 1961, the world was still holding its breath from that soft Russian beep. The Cold War had shifted into orbit, and the battlefield was no longer Europe or Berlin. It was the black vacuum above. The United States had fallen behind, and President Kennedy's voice carried the nation's restlessness into a single sentence. We choose to go to the moon. It was a line that sounded like destiny, but for the men who had once served a different flag, it felt like something closer to absolution. Werner von Braun stood at the center of it all, a man who had reinvented himself so completely that even he seemed to believe the new story. His hair was silver now, his accent softened, his posture that of a college professor rather than a wartime engineer. In front of cameras, he spoke of exploration, of mankind's urge to reach higher, to see farther. He smiled, gestured toward models of rockets, and spoke of peace. But those who worked beside him sometimes saw something different, an unease that flickered just behind his eyes when old words surfaced in conversation, or when a reporter asked about Peenemünde. He would change the subject quickly, as if memory itself were classified. In Huntsville, his team expanded to thousands. Engineers from across the country, fresh from universities, full of ideals, were folded into the old German Corps. They worked under a slogan that sounded clean and modern: "We build the future." The past, they were told, was irrelevant. What mattered was precision, reliability, and velocity they achieved. The Saturn rockets took shape piece by piece, their engines tested until the ground itself trembled. Reporters called Huntsville Rocket City. Von Braun became a celebrity, touring schools, appearing on television alongside Disney animators, explaining space travel to children who saw no contradiction in his accent. To them, he wasn't a former enemy. He was the face of America's greatest dream. But in the quiet corners of the federal bureaucracy, not everyone was dreaming. Inside the Justice Department, a small office had begun reopening old files, ones marked with the same paperclips that had once granted entry to America. A handful of investigators had been reading reports that didn't match the sanitized versions in the archives. Names that appeared in concentration camp documents now appeared in NASA rosters. Witnesses described conditions in underground rocket factories where thousands of slave laborers had died building V2s. The investigators compiled their findings carefully, page after page. But every time they tried to act, the resistance came not from the men under investigation, but from above. Senior officials argued that the revelations would embarrass the government, jeopardize national security, undermine the very narrative that had unified the country. The files were sealed again, this time under the new classification of Cold War sensitive. Outside Washington, the world had already chosen what it wanted to believe. Television screens filled with the glow of rocket launches. The countdowns became a kind of national prayer, a ritual that promised progress and victory. Each successful mission scrubbed away another layer of guilt. When John Glenn orbited the Earth, when Apollo 8 showed humanity, its own reflection rising over the moon, people felt cleansed. History had been rewritten in light and static. And yet, beneath the noise, the unease remained. Some of the engineers who had joined the program later said that they could feel it, the quiet division between those who spoke of reaching for the stars and those who simply wanted to outpace the Soviets. The work consumed everyone. Days blended into nights. The moon was no longer a distant symbol. It had become a deadline. In the summer of 1969, that deadline arrived. Millions watched as a thin, trembling voice announced that a man had walked on the lunar surface. Church bells rang. Crowds filled the streets. For a few hours, the world was united in awe. But in Huntsville, amid the cheering and champagne, a few of the older men stood apart from the crowd. They had built the machine that carried mankind to another world, and in doing so, had buried their own. For von Braun, it was the peak and the turning point. The Apollo program had validated everything he had promised. The world saw a visionary, not a former Nazi. But in the years that followed, the spotlight began to dim, and questions began to slip through the cracks. Journalists started asking where the technology had really come from. Survivors from Mittelwerk, the underground factory that had built the V2s, began telling their stories. They spoke of starvation, of whips and hangings, of engineers who inspected their work with cold detachment. Documents surfaced, showing that some of those engineers now held senior positions in the American space program. NASA issued careful statements. The Department of Defense deferred comment. Von Braun himself rarely addressed it. When he did, he spoke softly, saying that he had been a scientist, not a soldier, that he had worked for a cause larger than politics. But the words rang hollow for those who had seen what larger causes could do. By the 1970s, Operation Paperclip was no longer a secret. Congressional hearings, investigative reports, and declassified documents revealed what had been hidden for decades. The truth was complicated and uncomfortable. The same men who had built weapons for a genocidal regime had also helped win the race to space. For the public, it was a revelation that felt almost impossible to reconcile. America had conquered the moon, but part of that victory was built on borrowed shadows. Von Braun retired quietly, his health failing, his fame fading into nostalgia. When he died in 1977, newspapers praised him as a pioneer. Only a few mentioned the other story, the one written in the tunnels beneath the Harz Mountains, where the screams of forced laborers once echoed off concrete walls. And yet, even after the truth came out, the world didn't look away. The rockets still stood in museums. The astronauts still spoke of him with reverence. The moral ledger was too heavy to balance, so most people simply stopped trying. That was perhaps the final legacy of Operation Paperclip. Not the rockets, not the satellites, not even the moon landing, but the quiet realization that nations built on ideals are still made of people. And people will always find a way to justify what they need to believe. Because in the end, the Cold War wasn't just a struggle for power. It was a struggle for narrative. And the story that America chose to tell about itself had no room for ghosts. But they were still there, all the same. They lingered in the archives, in the redacted memos and faded photographs, in the names etched onto patents and mission badges. They lingered in every countdown, every plume of fire rising into the sky. A reminder that even our greatest achievements carry the weight of what we chose to forget. If you stood at Cape Canaveral today and watched a rocket climb through the clouds, you'd see nothing but light and motion. But in the silence that follows the thunder, if you listen closely enough, you might hear something else. Not applause, not celebration. Just the faint echo of men who once believed they could reach heaven by any means necessary, and the nation that decided to follow them there. The story didn't end with the rockets. It rarely does. After the cameras stopped rolling and the flags were folded away, the engineers of Operation Paperclip scattered like the seeds of a storm. Some stayed in Huntsville, their children speaking perfect English, their accents dissolving into the air. Others drifted into universities, defense contractors, and the growing web of private aerospace companies that carried the Cold War's ambitions quietly into the next century. The world forgot their origins, but their fingerprints never faded. By the 1980s, a new generation of scientists and policymakers had grown up under the soft glow of the space age. They believed the story that had been told to them, that America's ascent into the heavens was a pure act of imagination, driven by courage and genius. Few knew that the men who built those machines had walked through tunnels lined with corpses, or that the first blueprints for the space shuttle's engines were drawn by people once loyal to a regime that treated human life as expendable material. But history is like gravity. It never truly lets go. In the late 20th century, as classified documents began to surface through leaks, lawsuits, and freedom of information requests, the myth began to crack. Declassified memos showed how intelligence officers had scrubbed Nazi affiliations from personnel files, how scientists who should have stood trial at Nuremberg were instead given suburban homes and federal pensions. The revelations didn't cause outrage so much as exhaustion. The Cold War was over. The Berlin Wall had fallen. The public had grown accustomed to moral fog. A few historians tried to sound alarms. They pointed out that Operation Paperclip hadn't just imported scientists. It had imported a mindset that technological progress excused everything, that knowledge itself was neutral, and that morality could be deferred until after the work was done. It was a quiet kind of contagion, spreading through boardrooms and laboratories, until the line between defense and discovery became impossible to see. In the 1990s, the US government formally acknowledged the program. The official report spoke in calm, bureaucratic tones. The necessity of competitive advantage, the realities of post-war exigency. The words were carefully chosen, drained of emotion. Nowhere did they mention the faces of the forced laborers who built the V-2 rockets in the bowels of Mittelwerk, or the corpses stacked like wood when production slowed. The report closed with a single sentence that felt like both confession and dismissal. The contributions of these scientists were significant to national security and space exploration. For most people, that was enough. The world was moving too fast for ghosts. But inside the archives, other files remained sealed. Notes from intelligence briefings, reports on human experiments conducted under the guise of aviation medicine, even lists of individuals who had slipped quietly into other government projects, chemical weapons, psychological studies, biological testing, threads that, if pulled too hard, would unravel more than history. By the time anyone tried, the men themselves were gone. Their obituaries spoke of innovation, leadership, and the triumph of science. Their graves were marked by quiet plaques, their past lives unmentioned. The paperclips had done their work perfectly, yet the legacy they left behind was not just in rockets or equations. It was in the culture that grew from them. A belief that secrecy was sometimes synonymous with security, that ends justified means, and that progress could only be measured in distance and speed. You can see it in the programs that followed. Covert testing on soldiers and civilians during the Cold War. The development of surveillance systems that would one day monitor entire populations. The endless appetite for new technology with uncertain consequences. The language was always the same. National defense, scientific advancement, the greater good. The ghosts of Paperclip didn't whisper anymore. They spoke through policy. In Huntsville, the old laboratories still stand, their walls thick with layers of paint and history. Inside the museums, visitors walk past gleaming rockets that reach toward the ceiling. Few notice the small brass plaque tucked beside the display, a dedication to the pioneers of space exploration. There are no names. Perhaps that's fitting. In Germany, the underground tunnels of Mittelwerk have been preserved as a memorial. The air there is cold and still. Visitors walk through the dim corridors where thousands died constructing the V-2s. The concrete walls are etched with faint scratches, initials, dates, prayers in languages long forgotten. At the far end of the tunnel, a guide explains that these same rockets, designed here under the lash, would one day evolve into the Saturn V. The irony hangs heavy, impossible to ignore. And somewhere in that uneasy silence, you can feel the weight of the bargain that the world made. The truth of Operation Paperclip is not that it was a betrayal of American ideals. It's that it revealed how fragile those ideals really were, how easily they could be bent by fear, ambition, and the intoxicating pull of progress. The men who orchestrated it didn't see themselves as villains. They saw themselves as pragmatists, protecting the nation from a darker future. In their minds, it was a choice between evil and necessity. between letting knowledge die with its creators or using it to build something greater. The problem was that no one ever stopped to ask what that something greater might cost. Now, decades later, the consequences still echo. Every time a new technology emerges faster than ethics can catch it, artificial intelligence, genetic manipulation, weapons that think for themselves, the same justification reappears. If we don't do it, someone else will. It's the oldest logic in the book, born in the ashes of a world that swore it would never repeat its mistakes. And yet, here we are. If you stand today at the edge of the White Sands missile range, where the desert stretches endless and silent, you can still find fragments of the old V-2s half buried in the sand. They're corroded now, their edges eaten by time, their numbers barely legible. But if you pick one up, it feels strangely light, hollow almost, like a relic from another reality. You could hold it to your ear and almost hear the echo of engines, the hum of ambition, the voices of men who believed they could reshape the world. And maybe they did. Because in the end, Operation Paperclip wasn't just about stolen science. It was about what happens when morality itself becomes negotiable, when a nation decides that the future is worth any price, as long as someone else pays it. And that's the part no one likes to talk about. It always comes back to silence. The same kind that hung over Germany in 1945, and later over the deserts of New Mexico. A silence that isn't the absence of sound, but the space between what we know and what we choose to ignore. Decades have passed since the last paperclip scientist drew a paycheck, yet the program's ghost has never left the room. You can find it in every classified lab, every gleaming facility where the doors are locked from the inside, and progress is measured in secrecy. It lives in the tension between curiosity and control, that fine line where discovery turns into domination. In some ways, we inherited more than their technology. We inherited their philosophy. Today, when governments talk about dual-use research, about artificial intelligence that can create or destroy, about biological engineering that can cure or erase, they're speaking in the language born from that post-war compromise. A language that says knowledge is power, and power must be seized before someone else takes it first. It's the same argument that once justified the paperclips. Only the vocabulary has changed. We call it innovation now. There's a line that runs straight from the ruins of Peenemünde to the satellites orbiting overhead, to the data farms humming in the desert, to the quiet laboratories mapping the human genome and teaching machines to think. The line doesn't curve or hesitate. It simply continues, as if history itself were an unbroken experiment. And every so often, we look up from our screens and realize we've built a world powered by ideas whose origins we've tried to forget. The men of Operation Paperclip are gone, but their work has outlived them. Their rockets became spacecraft. Their guidance systems became missiles. Their research on the limits of the human body evolved into the technologies that now watch, measure, and predict us. The world they helped create has no single battlefield. It's everywhere, all the time. Sometimes, late at night, in the halls of aerospace museums or the archives of old military installations, a janitor might pause beneath the display of a rocket suspended from the ceiling. The metal gleams under fluorescent light, the same cold silver it had in 1944. There's a plaque beside it, polished and polite, listing specifications, thrust, range, payload, but not the names of the men who first designed it. Those names are in other files, stamped redacted or declassified in part. Outside, the night sky looks the same as it did when those men first dreamed of reaching it. Stars hung in perfect indifference, the universe neither forgiving nor accusing. That was always the irony. For all their brilliance, they were never really reaching for the stars. They were running from the past. And America, eager to outrun its enemies, ran with them. In the end, Operation Paperclip wasn't a story about villains rescued from justice or scientists redeemed by progress. It was about a country that, faced with the edge of the unknown, chose to step forward, even if it meant dragging its own conscience behind. It was about how easily morality can be suspended when the horizon looks bright enough. If you walk today through the tunnels of Mittelwerk, or across the launch pads of Cape Canaveral, or the dust plains of White Sands, you'll notice something strange. The air feels the same. Still, heavy, almost expectant, as though it's waiting for someone to acknowledge what was buried beneath it. Maybe that's all history really is. The sound of unfinished conversations. The truth of Operation Paperclip is not hidden in archives or redacted memos. It lives in the choices we make every time we trade ethics for advantage, every time we decide that the future justifies the means. It lives in the silence that follows progress. Because silence, after all, is comfortable. It's where ambition catches its breath. It's where secrets grow roots. And if you stand in that silence long enough, you begin to understand what the men of Paperclip must have known. That once you convince yourself you're building for tomorrow, it becomes easy to forget who was buried underneath today. The rockets have cooled, the scientists are gone, the documents have yellowed. But the logic remains, whispering beneath the hum of modern machines. If we don't, someone else will. That's how it started. That's how it always starts. And somewhere, out beyond the horizon, the echo still lingers. The sound of engines, the breath of history, the faint reminder that progress and conscience have never traveled at the same speed. The sky above is quiet now. But the silence, as always, is alive.